Thank you so much. Really appreciate the invitation to come here. It's obviously a strange year that we've gone through this year, and a lot of people have, as a consequence of that, they've sort of scratched their head and tried to work out what will come next and how will work evolve and how will it will adapt. I think one of the interesting things for me is that probably we've witnessed as much change this year as anyone would have anticipated for the rest of our working lives. A lot of organizations might have sat there at the start of February and fetishized how tech firms work. They might have thought, okay, I'm intrigued what tech firms can do, and yet most of them found themselves catching up and really doing the equivalent of what the most advanced tech firms did by the end of March. So it's just firstly, it's an interesting reminder that as much as we might think that we are behind other organizations, actually we're able to bridge that gap far quicker than we realize. And I've found myself, I do a weekly newsletter that sort of looks at these changes, looks at the way we're evolving. It seems that if we look at the statistics right now, the vast majority of British workers feel that they want to work 2 days a week at home. Raises a really interesting question about what work will look like and how we're going to create a new version of work. Because one of the things that we can definitely do is look at the companies that maybe have done these things before and found what went wrong. And when we look at them, there seems to be some pretty big pointers. So I've become fascinated with some of the organizations who maybe have experimented with remote work before and have got lessons to tell us. Some of those firms really are sort of the second wave of internet companies. So companies that maybe were competing with Google, Facebook, big firms, Salesforce, and they found that they couldn't necessarily compete with perks and benefits. So they started differentiating in other ways. And these might be firms like Basecamp. There might be firms like Automatic. They're the company that makes WordPress. And what they learned very quickly is that they allowed their workers to be fully self-determining, to work from home, work remotely whenever they wanted. But what they discovered very quickly was that the office has a network effect to it. The reason why the office had some real strength to it is because we knew that the big boss was there. We knew that the head of marketing was there. The research person was there. We knew that we could talk to all of those people in a 10, 15-minute window. And what these remote firms discovered was that they had these glorious offices. If you can imagine the sort of the Apple store, this beautiful place, beautifully appointed. And yet what people discovered was they would go into that office and, robbed of the network effect, the office didn't have its benefit. So the average commute in the UK is around an hour. If you've made an hour's journey into the office and then you discover that you're on video calls with people who are back at home, next time you're going to make the journey, you think to yourself, well, was that worthwhile? Was it worth the cost? Was it worth the stress? Was it worth the unproductivity of being in traffic? And so you ask yourself that question next time you decide not to do it. I think this is one of the reasons why we're going to emerge into a different form of work. If we do go to this situation where the norm is people working from home a couple of days a week, we are going to go into a situation where there's probably a degree of different codes. And so Rory Sutherland, who I know has spoken at Jenny Feather events before, but Rory Sutherland talks about people becoming twats working Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. It's an acronym, forgive me. And so you might have a code where maybe you've got some salespeople in your organization and they might be working Monday, Friday, MFs and twats. And this will be the new world that we're living in. And trying to create a code, because we know then that these people will be in on certain days. Why? Then we can take advantage of that network effect. We can take advantage of the coming together and connecting with people. I've been really intrigued, though, with one of the debates that's taken hold in the midst of all of this about resilience. And resilience is this strange concept where we often talk about resilience, and often resilience is what we invoke in others rather than necessarily demand of ourselves. So I found myself on a radio interview with Robert Peston about a month ago. And Robert Peston did what is very much a common use of the word. He said, young people, they need to be more resilient right now. In fact, I saw something written in the Sunday Times. It was written by the person who's responsible, the editor of the Times Educational Supplement. And this person, they were writing a guide to universities for next year. And they said, Generation Snowflake needs to learn how to be more resilient. And this is often how we see the term. We see the term described to some extent, labeling a weakness in others and suggesting that somehow they need to be hardier. So I found myself really intrigued with this. Firstly, is there a strength of response that some people exhibit that others don't? Is there sort of a more robust response that maybe we might witness? And what are the ingredients of it? And I found myself really intrigued in delving into some of the research on it. And what you discover is there's no shortage of research into resilience. In fact, it's a developing area because there's so much intrigue and so much it's sort of curiosity about what might characterize this resilient response. People are very interested in exploring it. And what you discover is that resilience in many ways shares characteristics with other things. To me, resilience and demanding resilience of people has got one interesting parallel. I don't know if you've ever experienced this, if you've ever found yourself in a situation of distress or anxiety and someone comes in and they notice how you're feeling and they ask you to calm down. Did that ever work? Someone said to me last week, never in the history of calming down has someone calmed down by being asked to calm down. I thought that was a good outline, because never in the history of being resilient has someone been resilient by being asked to be resilient. So I found myself really intrigued. What are the secret ingredients of resilience? What are the ways that any of us can respond in a more sturdy way? And what you discover is that there's a myth of resilience. And the myth of resilience is that in any way, this is a character trait or this is a behavior. What you discover, resilience is a process, and it's a dynamic process that develops over time. But generally, it comes as a collective, not an individual response to something. So I found myself looking into these things. And what you discover is these three critical components to resilience. A lot of this work goes back to work by scientists and researchers in the 1980s. But what you discover is these three critical components. First one is control. The second one is identity. And the third one is community. And to just go through each of those in turn, what we discover is that we can never exhibit a resilient response when we feel helpless. And you might witness this. I had the fortune, good or bad, to be in Lebanon this summer when the biggest city explosion, the biggest urban explosion in history took place. Unbelievable event. We were about 3 miles away. The ground shook like a sort of a 5 or 6 earthquake. I mean, the whole building shook, and then our windows blew out, and all of the air in the apartment that we were in sucked out. I mean, it was like end of days. It was impossible to witness what happened and not think something really, really bad had happened. So while our first instinct was we're in the midst of an earthquake, very quickly we realized something else was going on. But the BBC the next day was pretty characteristic of the coverage that Lebanon often gets and Beirut often gets. The BBC said the Lebanese are resilient people. And I was really intrigued with that, because quite often we see people who are the victims of circumstance, and we either project resilience onto them or we have an expectation that they will respond in a resilient way. But it was a really interesting contrast for me, because the next day I saw someone in the Lebanese news saying, stuff resilience, we're fed up with being resilient, we just want justice. And I thought it was an intriguing thing that quite often we find ourselves witnessing this. And back to my point, one of the things we observe is for a resilient response, we need to demonstrate that we've got control over our circumstances. We see this in countless examples. Science is littered with horrific experiments on animals, but one of these experiments was that a group of scientists they immobilized rats and put them in water. So they immobilized them, injecting them with Botox, and they put them in water, but they gave half of the rats the ability to chew. So barbaric experiment. I'm really sorry for even referencing it. But what you discover is the rats who could chew, the rats who had some degree of agency over themselves, had significantly less stress and responded far better to their circumstance. And we see this time and time again. When we look at nurses who work relentless hours and long hours, the ones who feel that they're in control of their circumstance have significantly lower burnout and respond much better to stress. So being in a situation where we feel we have some agency and some autonomy is a really critical component of a resilient response. And I mentioned two other parts: identity and community. We see vast evidence of the impact that identity has on the story that we tell about ourselves and the way that we respond to circumstances. There's a really interesting social experiment that happened in about 10, 15 years ago, which was called the BBC prison experiment. And it borrowed some of the lessons from what you might have heard of the Stanford prison experiment. It took a group of civilians, normal people, turned half of them into guards and half of them into prisons. Into prisoners. And very quickly, what they established was that the way that people identified themselves and the way that they had pride in their own situation had a big bearing on their response to things. Over time, the guards became less and less proud of the role that they were having and the rules they were having to impose upon others. The prisoners became increasingly proud. And the way that we saw this expressed is the prisoners developed, their well-being went up, their stress levels went down, and they became increasingly happy. And the inverse happened with the guards. Their stress levels went through the roof. They weren't happy with the group they were associated with. And over time, actually, a few of them broke ranks and started hanging around with the prisoners. Identity and the sense of belonging is a really critical part of a resilient response. And we see strong evidence of it. And I think that links into the final part of a resilient response, understanding how we can respond in a more hardy way. And that's the idea of community. I was researching one leading person who looks into this, and he talked about the importance of church. And he said, all of the evidence suggests that the positive benefit that people get from going to church is nothing to do with faith and everything to do with community. When we feel connected to people around us, it seems to have a much stronger response, and it puts us in a much better position. And we see some fascinating evidence for this. People who have serious injuries or strokes or pain, the more groups that they are affiliated to after their medical mishap, the quicker they respond. People who feel connected to other people seem to react in a very different way. And I think that's very relevant to the way we're feeling now. A lot of us might be sitting there mourning the lack of daylight. Can't believe the fact that it seems before when we look up from our computers, it's 4 o'clock and it's pitch black outside. And that sense of isolation is one of the critical things that I think is making this experience especially bad. The BBC yesterday reported that levels of loneliness have gone up by 60% since the start of lockdown. A lot of people are feeling isolated. So if we're trying to think of a response that is resilient, then thinking of how we can access that community seems really helpful. I did something on my podcast where I chatted to, across 4 episodes, 4 leading experts who tried to understand how organizations can build community amongst their workers. So I'm out of time, a really brief opportunity to talk about these things. But for me, this is a really critical lesson. As any of us are thinking about resilience and how we can improve a resilient response, we need to stop thinking that resilience is something that we demand of other people and start thinking of the levers that we've got to activate it. Important levers like control, community, and identity. And I think if we focus on those things, we can actually strengthen our own collective resilience rather than demand it of others.
Thank you so much for that, Bruce. I found that really, really interesting. And as you say, in these most difficult of times, it's important to recognize it's not simply a case of gritting our teeth and buckling down. There's so many factors at play here. I'm sure I can see people in the chat found that really, really interesting. Just before we finish, Bruce, I have to ask you for your 15-second summary. If you could summarize what you've been speaking about today in just 15 seconds for people to take away, how would you do that?
The myth of resilience is that in some way it's this individual character trait that some of us have got and some of us haven't got. Resilience is a collective response that we need to think about how, as a group, we can be collectively stronger.
Thank you, Bruce. And yeah, thank you once again for that. I think that's fascinating. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, if there's any questions, happily take any questions on LinkedIn, or if people get a hold of me via my website, Eat, Sleep, Work, Repeat. But, very willing to answer any questions there, but I know time is short.